What it does tell us is that often in history, the good people have bad things happen to them. But faith says that the right eventually triumphs.
But not, apparently, without innumerable victories for evil along the way. Through the Middle Ages and beyond, sightings of and crusades against the Antichrist would lead to the slaughter of countless innocents. The word Antichrist has been used throughout history to demonize everyone from popes to presidents to pop stars. It has been a rallying cry and a death knell, triggering passions both deadly and divine. And yet, Antichrist, perhaps the most highly charged word in the Christian lexicon, is buried in the Bible, where it appears in minor passages just a handful of times.
Probably coming as a surprise to most people, the word Antichrist only appears in about the two most obscure books that you can find in the Bible, 1 John and 2 John, two very short letters.
According to scholars, these letters or epistles were written near the end of the 1st century A.D. During this period, Christians were fighting fiercely among themselves about whether Jesus, the Son of God, had actually existed in the flesh.
And every spirit that does not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is not of God, and this is the spirit of the Antichrist.
And he defines them in terms of those who deny the humanity of Jesus. So we can see this writing is against the backdrop of the developing Gnostic version of Christianity.
Gnosticism was a religious and philosophical movement that threatened to splinter early Christianity.
The epistles of John portray those who do not accept Jesus as the Son of God or as somehow a human form, as somehow representing false doctrine and therefore representing an Antichrist figure.
But how could the Antichrist sentiment in the epistles of John morph into an absolute evil, flesh and blood Antichrist?
Think of the emerging figure of Antichrist as a kind of magnet, which attracts disparate texts and figures to gradually coalesce into a full-blown legend, which in itself is not present in the scriptures. As Christians came to get a greater and greater sense of who Jesus was as God on earth, the contrast, that is the final human enemy, also becomes clearer and develops as the kind of shadow side, perhaps.
In the form of a man appeared the Savior, and in the form of a man will the other also come.
For the first time, a flesh and blood portrait of an Antichrist emerges. But this passage isn't from Daniel, Revelation, or the epistles of John. It was written in 202 A.D. by Hippolytus, a prolific theologian of the early Christian church. In his treatise On Christ and Antichrist, Hippolytus brings together ideas about the Antichrist that were prevalent in the early church, including a belief that would serve as a pretext for much bloodshed through the centuries, that the Antichrist, like Christ himself, would be of Jewish origin, from the Hebrew tribe of Dan.
That element, that is Antichrist as a Jew, and was accepted by the Jews, was one of the elements certainly that was present in much of the pogroms and persecutions of the Jews in later history.
During the Crusades, the Antichrist's name would be invoked to stir hatred against both Muslims and Jews.
I think the most destructive uses of the Antichrist legend in the course of history have been when Christians have identified the outsiders as, if not Antichrist, at least Antichrist's predecessors, Antichrist's army, etc. This has been evident in persecution of the Jews at numerous times. It's especially evident, of course, in the conflict between Christianity and Islam.
In the First Crusade, launched by Pope Urban II in 1095, mobs of peasants, the People's Crusade, devastated Jewish settlements along the Rhine. In the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, there was wholesale slaughter of Muslims and Jews in the city.
The apocalyptic element in the Crusades became very, very important. perhaps even more powerful after the city of Jerusalem is recaptured by the Muslims in the year 1187.
The Muslim general Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem in 1187 led to arguments that he was the Antichrist. Interestingly, Muslims also have an Antichrist figure called the Dajjal, who first appeared around the 9th century in the Hadith, a collection of the Prophet Muhammad's sayings and stories of his daily life.
The notion of the one who's not really a Christ, but trying to give an image of being a leader, of being a Messiah. So the word Dajjal itself, of course, means a deceiver in Arabic, or a blatant liar, and it's someone who's a false Messiah. And this notion is also found, of course, in the biblical text. So there is this distinct notion that the idea of Dajjal is directly linked to this idea of the Antichrist.
During the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, the word Antichrist was even used by Christian against Christian.
Reformers found it incumbent upon themselves to justify their break with Catholicism. No easier way was that than to look at the Pope as the feared Antichrist. And for what it's worth, the Pope returned the favor and began to name each of the Protestant reformers as agents of the Antichrist on earth.
The power of naming the Antichrist proved to be highly seductive, especially as a form of prophecy. In the middle of the 16th century, Nostradamus, the famous French physician and seer, wrote enigmatic verses that interpreters say identify 3 Antichrists.
The most famous of Nostradamus' quatrains about Napoleon is Century 8, Quatrain 1. And it says, Pau ne Laurent will be more of fire than of the blood. Pau ne Laurent are 3 small towns in southwestern France. And if you just simply move them around a little bit, they spell quite accurately Napoleon. Hitler was the second Antichrist. He's referred to as Hister, which is an old word for the Danube River.
Although that may sound impressive, most critics caution that Nostradamus' prophecies are so hazy that they're bound to find a plausible fit as the centuries roll by. Like the quatrain in which Nostradamus identifies the 3rd Antichrist as an evil figure named Mabus. Creative interpreters of the quatrain have claimed that the last Antichrist is everyone from Saddam Hussein to Russian President Vladimir Putin.
There's been a giant tale throughout history of what I call pinning the tail on the Antichrist. And whatever needs to be identified at that moment as the worldly threat for which we rally the troops and have unquestioning opposition to, Antichrist can take that image.
But there is a dominant image of the Antichrist today, that of a slick man of peace with an agenda from hell. Some Christians contend this image can be found in the Bible, and they've been turning it into publishing gold for decades. But who is this Antichrist really? A man? A myth? A monster? And what does he want with us? The story of the Antichrist has grown chapter by chapter, century by century. His identity, forged from ancient myth and highly symbolic biblical passages, has proven so durable that the name Antichrist has been on the lips of warring factions, oppressed peoples, and political rivals for centuries. To anticipate who and what a future Antichrist might be, you have only to look at what he has been.
Will Antichrist be an external enemy, or is he an internal enemy in the church or even within ourselves? Will Antichrist be one, or will Antichrist be many? Will Antichrist be a terrible persecutor that we should dread, or is he fundamentally a religious deceiver? In a sense, Antichrist is all of these things, and each of them in various proportions as you sketch the history of the legend over 2,000 years.